All right, so today we're going to take a look at nationalism, and we're going to look at some different aspects of it. We've mentioned it before, but it's a wide and encompassing idea. So we want to look at it today, especially as it's linked to colonialism. Nationalism means that you are promoting your nation. So you see I've got a lovely image here for you of people with their flags. Flags are often symbol. Nationalism uses symbols very often. And we're going to see that the flag becomes one of those important symbols. Now, nationalism related to colonialism because, for example, if we want to promote our nation, we think our nation is good, right? Wonderful. And we don't want to be selfish, so we want to share our nation with others. Might be one way of looking at it. That is imperialism, sometimes called imperialism, or colonialism. Sometimes these words are used interchangeably, right? So colonialism means that basically a country, let's take Great Britain, for example, will then expand their influence and territory to other parts of the world instead of just the island where they are in Europe. That they will then begin to control places like India. We've talked about that before. India, parts of China or Asia, parts of Africa, parts of South America. In fact, Britain used to claim, not now of course, but they used to be able to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British Empire. The sun never sets. So that means that as the sun travels around the globe, it's always shining on territory controlled by Great Britain. So from Europe to Central South America to Pacific and Asia to India, Central Asia, Africa. The sun never sets on the British Empire. So this is one way in which a form of nationalism can actually spread to other parts of the world, and that's usually called colonialism. In fact, one thing you might find interesting is that in these colonies, the people who are being colonized, let's take India, let's take England and India. England, or Great Britain, controls India. Some of the people who were born in India, right, they live in India, never even been to Great Britain, will adopt many of the British customs. And in fact, they will become more devoted to British customs than a lot of people in Britain. Does that make sense? In other words, you know how the British like their tea. They have tea time. Tea time in the afternoon, every afternoon. They have tea, usually something to nibble on, as they would say. Biscuits or something. Scones, something like that. And so people in India begin to have tea time. In Great Britain, they are very fond of a game called cricket. Any cricket aficionados here? Anybody play cricket? No, didn't think so. Not very popular in the United States. You cricket player? She's a cricket player, all right. Well, cricket becomes very popular. And the reason that cricket spreads around the world is because Britain had spread around the world. And so the people, that is the local people, say in India, I'm using them as an example, but it could be a lot of places in Africa, places elsewhere in Asia, they begin to play cricket. And so cricket becomes begins as a British symbol, it becomes adapted in these colonies, and then it becomes a source of pride to the colonies. In fact, then when they begin to beat the British, in their own game, of course, that's a source of pride, right? In the past, I used to be a grader. Anybody here ever take an AP history course? 2 of you, 3 of you, 4 of you, 5. Thank you. I see those hands. 5 or 6 of you. Well, you know, you write, you take a multiple choice. This is the way it used to be. I think it's still this way. And then you write essays. Right? It used to be 3 essays you had to write for the history exam. And I worked on AP World History. I was a grader for several years of AP World History. And students would have to write 3 essays. And if you got assigned to question 1, that is essay number 1, then you stayed on question number 1 the entire week. I was there for a week doing nothing but grading essay number 1 of hundreds and hundreds of essays. So we won't bring up those memories of sitting in a folding chair grading hundreds of essays from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. every day for 6 or 7 days in a row. But I remember one year, this is what reminds me of it, I can't get it out of my head, one of the questions was about cricket and how cricket was, used around the world, and the students were supposed to write an essay about how cricket was related to colonialism, imperialism, that kind of thing. I went over and over and over that. All right? So I guess that's why that example comes to my mind. Because cricket then becomes a kind of symbol. Well, one of the places we're going to look at today is Africa. We'll do that, and then we're going to move on to looking at some things to do with evolution and Darwin too, and how that might relate to some of this. So Africa certainly is one of the locations of European imperialism or colonialism. And eventually all of Africa, almost the entire continent, will be under the control of a European power. And all of that happens in the 19th century. In the beginning, Europeans weren't that interested in inland Africa. Mostly Africa was a barrier because they wanted to get elsewhere, and Africa was kind of in the way. I guess if I can put it that way. In other words, they wanted to sail from Portugal, Spain, or wherever. They wanted to sail to where the spices were. They got involved because of the spice trade. And to do that, of course, they had to go around Africa. What some people decided to do, like Columbus, is to sail the other direction and get to the spices by going west to get east. Of course, he didn't know these continents were over here, which kind of got in his way again, and no good way around it. So that's what got it all started. Along the way, however, slavery was involved. Now, actually, the slave trade from Africa began with the Muslim slave traders in East Africa. And as the Europeans are going looking for spices and they find out Africa is a lot bigger than they thought, they then get involved in slave trade in West Africa. But that kept the Europeans really along the coast. Because the way the slave trade would work is the Europeans would come and negotiate with Africans along the coast, who then had captured Africans that were their enemies further inland, and they would do the buying and selling along the coast. So that kept the Europeans along the coast. Ironically, or perhaps sadly, once slave trade is coming to be phased out and being outlawed, that's what got the Europeans more interested in inland part of Africa. So it's kind of the opposite effect of what you might think. That once the slave trade was sort of ended, that Europeans didn't care anymore about Africa. No, cared a lot more about what was internal in Africa. And when they found out that Africa had things like diamonds and gold, of course, all kinds of resources, the climate of it, there you could grow things that they couldn't grow in Europe. Things from the New World like cocoa beans, and you could grow coffee all over. You could grow other kinds of plants that you couldn't grow in Europe. So large plantations were set up. All right, so that's sort of our precursor. So that means that by the time you get to World War I, which is the early 20th century, almost the entire continent of Africa has now been colonized by various European powers. Now, this is going to lead to conflict. One of the areas that we're going to see that we'll just highlight today, just for an example, is South Africa. In South Africa, there were various tribes, various groups. For example, the Zulu and the Zulu warriors. The Zulu lived in South Africa, and there were settlers there, colonists that came to South Africa. These colonists actually are of Dutch descent. Dutch descent. And they come to be called Afrikaners because they spoke the Dutch language, and the Dutch language gets kind of modified into Afrikaans, which is a language of South Africa. So these are white Europeans that are settling in South Africa along the coast. And then, of course, they're encountering the local people there. So we have Afrikaner independent states, which are affiliated with European settlers, and they end up living there for 150, 200 years. I mean, they moved there pretty early on. They begin to do battle. They have warfare, fights of different kinds with the local people, including the Zulu warriors. Shaka was one of the Zulu leaders of the Zulu warriors. They are eventually defeated, and the Afrikaners set up independent states. For example, the Orange Free State and the South African Republic, called the Transvaal. This is by the 1830s. This is happening. So this is, I think, the earliest of the European settlers, and they really are becoming farmers. They really are settling the land, developing the land. They're not just there for trade. They intend on living there long term, and they intend on farming, raising animals, cattle, that sort of thing. So with that beginning then, let's say in the certainly by 1830, that part is done. But still, not a lot of Africa is colonized over the next 40 years. It's mostly in the south. So about 10%, let's say roughly 10% of the area of Africa, and of course Africa is a huge continent, has colonial rule. Some of that's along the north, the northern borders along the Mediterranean, Egypt, and then way down in the south in South Africa. But in the middle, not much there. But all that's going to change from 1870 to, let's say, 1900, 1910, over the next 30 or 40 years. they begin to expand, that is, they being the Europeans, they expand inland. And lots of different countries get involved. We already talked about the Dutch, but certainly the French, the British, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all begin to take control of Africa. Now, I put a picture here because I want to talk about, we're sort of talking about the mechanics of it, where it happened, when it happened. I want to try to take a look at the why, or at least try to understand some of the why it happened. There's a picture here. The picture on the screen is of Rudyard Kipling. You ever heard of Rudyard Kipling? You may have read some of his stories. He wrote children's stories, poems and things, and perhaps you've seen the Disney movie called The Jungle Book. If anybody saw The Jungle Book, that is based upon a story by Rudyard Kipling. Or there was a poem, a story called Rikki Tikki Tavi. I don't know if you ever heard of that. You know that one? It's about a mongoose. I guess it's a mongoose. It takes out a snake, protects the people in the house. Anyway, he has a lot of those kind of stories. They're sort of geared to, I guess, children, adolescents. And a lot because Rudyard Kipling grows up, he's British, but he grows up in India. He lives most of his life in India. But his parents were British. And so this gives him an interesting perspective, a different perspective than maybe somebody who just lived in Britain would have, or somebody who just lived in India. And so he kind of merged those things together. One of the things that he writes, which is not in most children's books, is a poem that he entitles The White Man's Burden. The White Man's Burden. And I believe your textbook has an excerpt of it. Your textbook does have excerpts in it, usually in little inset boxes. I think they're in tan, or anyway, they're in a different color. And they have sources, documents, that sort of thing. So you want to take a look at that. Take a look at those when you're looking through your textbook. Anyway, The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling, born in 1865. He dies in 1936. What is this burden? The burden, and you kind of see a little cartoon of the burden. The guy's carrying this burden on his back. Basically, the idea here that Rudyard Kipling had is that the people of Europe, since they had more advanced civilizations, in his opinion, had a duty, they had a burden that they needed to bring civilization to the rest of the world. What do I mean by civilization? Well, infrastructure, a lot of it, roads, postal, like post office, postal communication, telegraph, medical care, hospitals, education, schools, colleges, stable government. Okay? So in his opinion, Rudyard Kipling, and he wasn't the only one, he is just conveying it in this poem that makes it very succinct, so he gets used as the example. But the idea here is that the Europeans need, or it's their duty, to in fact help, in their opinion, helping other people develop into places that have better health care, better education, better transportation, better communication. Now, of course, in the process, they're also controlling those areas. All right? So you might say there's an upside and a downside to this. For the local people, I suppose most people would like better health care, right? Better education, better roads. But of course, it comes at a cost. And the cost is control. Say if the British And the British were pretty good about building the infrastructure, really, they were. But it meant the British are going to want to control things. So if you want complete independence, well, the British, that's going to be hard to obtain. It will eventually come, but it's going to be hard to obtain. So anyway, really what the sort of focus of the poem, if you sort of read it carefully, of White Man's Burden, is that Rudyard Kipling is trying to get the United States involved, or more involved, in doing this. You say, look, us Europeans have been sort of carrying this burden by ourselves. Now, United States, you're sort of coming of age now. You are wealthier. You have more influence. And so you too need to help in this process of spreading this kind of stuff around the world. The United States did not get as involved. I won't say they didn't do any of this, but they were not as involved because we had a huge continent that we were spreading across in the 19th century, right? In the 1800s, we go across to California, we go all across the plains, we go from sea to shining sea, eventually. So we're very occupied sort of with what we consider to be our own land, and we're not as interested in elsewhere. Now we do, obviously, have influence in South America, Central, the Caribbean. We do get involved with the war with Spain, which really starts in the Caribbean, but kind of leads us to the Philippines. So, there's a few places where we have, in the Pacific, there's a few places, and of course in the Caribbean. But not as extensive as many of the European powers. We don't get involved, and in part that's because we're still developing ourselves. We're still moving across this vast continent of North America. Well, anyway, the idea here is that the Europeans, or the white man, was more advanced in technology, more advanced in industry, probably medicine and other areas, and therefore it was their duty or their burden to take these advancements to other people, as I just explained, around the world. And what he's doing here is he's appealing to the United States, the U.S., to take up this burden. Help us out. He's saying it's your duty, too. All right, so to some extent, I suppose, I don't know how much people in the United States were aware of his poem and how much that influenced things, but it does speak to the attitudes of Europe. And it does speak to, in part, the way they see what they're doing. Now, of course, others could see it in a far more negative way, right? Controlling way. So I mentioned it here. Your textbook has this also. You can look up. I'm pretty confident your edition of the textbook has a little excerpt from this poem. Certainly you could Google that poem, Rudyard Kipling, White Man's Burden. You'd find it. Now, this kind of imperialism that basically says, okay, the Europeans are better than people in Asia or Africa. Is there any intellectual backing for this? Well, many people thought the teachings of Charles Darwin certainly gave an intellectual background, an intellectual rationale for this. So we're going to talk a little bit about Darwin and then how Darwin's ideas begin to fit into this. Here's a picture of Charles Darwin. Again, a British, I guess we'd call him a naturalist, a scientist who looks at nature. He is very interested in going out, and really he's kind of a product of imperialism himself, because what's he going to do? He's going to leave Britain, he's going to sail on a boat all the way around the world, and he's going to record what he sees and then make conclusions about it. So, I mean, even the idea that, here is sort of the European guy in the boat who's going to come and understand things around the world, it's there. So, when is he doing this? He's doing this in the 1830s. The 1830s. He sails on a ship. His ship is called the Beagle. Okay? HMS Beagle, Her Majesty's ship, or His Majesty, I think in 1830. I think it's still Her Majesty's ship. Anyway, either way, that's what HMS means. Her or His Majesty's ship, the Beagle. This is a research vessel. It's not for cargo, it's not military, but it is taking him around to explore, to gather samples, to make drawings, observations, keep notebooks, all those kinds of things that scientists love to do, especially if you take a science lab. I would assume you'll have to take some notes. I hope they still make you do that now. Maybe not. Maybe you just Instagram it. Just gram it. People say gram it? They probably don't. I'm trying to get that to go. I'm trying to get the gram thing to go. So let's start using that. Instead of Instagram, let's just say gram it. Well, anyway. I guess it won't work. At any rate, one of the things that he sees that becomes an example are birds. We got a lot of birds around here, don't we? I just saw one fly by the window. But he's looking at small birds for this particular study. Finches. Okay? What he notices is that finches that he sees, especially out on the remote islands of the Galapagos. And by the way, the Galapagos Islands, I'll show you a map in a moment, but they're pretty far offshore of South America, in the Pacific. They're very remote islands. So I think the reason he went there is because it's not easy for animals and plants to find their way to these islands. Right? So a bird, potentially, I guess, could fly out there, but there's not going to be much interaction between things on the coast and things out on these islands. So it's an isolated population. And these finches that he sees, he notices that out on these islands, that there are different kinds of finches, even on these remote islands. There are finches that feed on the ground. There are finches that feed like in, say, small bushes. And then there are finches that live, say, up in trees or up higher. So they're actually feeding in 3 different levels. They're feeding on, some on insects, some on seeds, and so forth. So they have different diets and different habitats, slightly. So Charles Darwin speculates that originally there was only one kind of finch on the islands, but that the finches adapted to the environment of the islands there and developed into 3 separate, distinctly separate kind of finches. Okay? That makes sense? That's what he's saying. Now he calls that developing natural selection. That the environment will put pressure on a population, on an animal or a long line of animals, like say finches, to encourage, to force, to pressure this kind of thing. Why? Well, let's say all the finches were going to live on the ground and feed on nuts, just for the sake of argument, right? There are only so many nuts and things like that the finches can eat. So therefore, when that runs out, the finches start to die because they got nothing to eat. So some finches then begin to eat insects. Other finches begin to eat the nuts. Other finches eat things on the ground. So they actually then change, the finches adapt physically to match their habitat. Didn't think you're going to get a biology a lecture here. Well, it's not much of a biology lecture, but so what that means is, I don't know how much you are birdophiles. Birdophiles? Birdophobes? No. I don't know how, what's that? Bird watchers? Birdaholics? I don't know what the right term is. But, how much you actually pay attention to birds. But you can tell a lot about a bird. I used to watch a lot of, I used to have bird feeders and things. That's when I was up further north. Here, I don't know. I haven't figured everything out down here yet. But, for example, if you have a bird that has a bigger beak, a thicker beak, like a cardinal, some finches, they are actually have that big beak so that they can crush things like nuts. Yeah, like this. And as so you see the bottom there on the left. And then you see the one on the right has a thin beak. The thin beak is for getting insects. It's easier to get an insect and take it in. So you can see he finds these finches, and they have different beaks, and they have different habitats, but he believes that they came from one original kind of finch. And then it modified. It evolved into 4 kinds of finches. So this is the kind of stuff that he is talking about. He writes a lot of this down in his book, The Origin of the Species. In 1858. This is when he gets back. After his long journey, he gets back, and he begins to collect all his notes, and he writes this down. And he begins to then believe, teach, write, that he thought that there were much smaller numbers of species, and that things evolved into the multiplicity of species that we have. Well, Darwin's teachings certainly had an immediate effect on the way people thought about biology, right? Biology in the 1800s, in the 19th century. People began looking for, using these ideas to consider what to do, right? And how things worked. And, of course, these ideas still affect us today in a variety of ways, right? This idea of evolutionary thinking and evolutionary thought, it's in almost every field. Not just sciences, not just biology, but we think about it in education, we think about it in psychology, we think about it, lots of areas, okay? All right, and you're aware of that because you have been exposed to that, no doubt, for much of your education. But what may not be as familiar to you is that Darwin's ideas also have a political effect. The political effect of Darwin or Darwinism is also fairly immediate and with great impact. People who are, let's say, Europeans, he's British, right? So British, French, Germans, others, begin to accept Darwin's teachings, and what is Darwin saying? He's saying that some individuals are stronger than others. Have you heard the fittest, the survival of the fittest? This is one of the concepts of Darwinism. That if you have, let's say, one group, let's say of birds, that are better adapted than another, that group that's better adapted is going to strengthen and grow, and the other one's going to fade away and die. Okay? And so what didn't take people too much of a jump to take what Darwin was saying about animals, insects, birds, and so forth, and begin to expand that to talk about not only people, but societies. They began to teach that some societies were fitter than others. They were better than others. That already kind of fit the model, the colonialism model, right? Imperialistic model. The Europeans Why had the Europeans developed industry? Why had the Europeans traveled around the world and set up colonies? It's because the Europeans were fitter than other civilizations. And since they were fitter or fittest, then they ought to, not only will they survive, they ought to survive, because the survival of the fittest makes everything stronger in the end. That's sort of reducing down what Darwin says, but a basic concept, right? All right, so this political effect begins to enter into things after his publication in 1858. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But now, a little more about Darwin, just to show you a couple of maps. First of all, you see the Galapagos Islands are about 600 miles off the shore of South America. That's pretty remote. Today, of course, people can get there by plane, and tourism has started to come to these islands, and it's beginning to alter them. They were very remote, and most people never visited there. But now, you know, people like to have unusual vacations, and so this is an unusual one you can have. And you can see the route of HMS Beagle. The journey out in red, you see he leaves England, he sails down along the coast of South America, sails around the tip of South America, out to the Galapagos Islands. Then from the Galapagos Islands, he continues on around, heading to, say, New Zealand, I believe, Australia, South Africa, and then eventually back north to England. So he sails around the entire world on this research vessel, the Beagle. So here is some of the idea of natural selection that we've been talking about. The idea here, in a rudimentary form in this graph, that there were ancestral species and that changes came over time until you have multiple descendants. Some of them did not survive. They went extinct. Others diverged, kind of like those finches, some feeding on the ground, some in the bushes, some in the trees, some on insects, some on nuts, that sort of thing. And that's where you get the multiplicity of species coming from an ancestral species. And we're talking about the finches. He said he believed there was only one kind of finch that was there originally, and over a long period of time, multiple species develop of finches there. That's just one example, the finches. I put this picture up here in the upper right-hand corner. I'll explain what it is. It's supposed to be a drawing of trees, the trunks of trees, with moths on the trees. You see that? You got the light tree, the dark tree, the light moths, the dark moths. They were sometimes called the pepper moth. Well, this was something that was in textbooks years ago to try to explain natural selection. So I'll use it here to explain natural selection. But I think I should tell you it was found later to not actually be a good example. It's a good example to explain it, but I don't know if it's actually an accurate example. Okay. So, for example, you see on the left the lighter trunk tree. You see a dark moth and you see a lighter moth. The lighter moth is harder to see, right? Because it fits in to the trunk. It's up higher. Then, just reverse. Dark tree, dark moth, lighter moth. The darker moth fits in better. The lighter moth really shows up on the darker tree. The idea here is that in the example on the left, if a bird's flying by hungry, the bird more often is going to see the dark moth than the peppered moth or the light-colored moth, and will come down and have him for lunch. Kind of like Taco Tuesday. Except I guess it'd be Moth Monday for the birds. So they're going to pick up on the dark moth because they're going to be able to see it easier. But if things changed, then on the right, now the light moth really stands out and the dark moth blends in. And of course the idea is taken from England and Europe, where they're beginning to use a lot of coal, burning a lot of coal. And in fact, that coal dust gets in the sky, it gets in the soil, it gets in everything. And this was a phenomenon that a lot of times the bark of trees began to get darker. Okay. So there's your natural selection. What an animal, an insect looks like is going to affect how often it gets killed or eaten, if it's easier to see. Okay? Fairly simple example. This is why it was in a lot of textbooks. I don't know if the example actually holds up exactly this with the peppered moth, but that's what we're talking about with natural selection, that forces of nature might change, and when they change, different animals will be selected for unequally, let's say for food. Okay? So, and then that pressure would mean, in the second scenario, that the darker moth should have an increase in its population. The lighter colored moth, the peppered moth, would then become a target and its population would begin to diminish. Okay, so that's natural selection. That's involved in evolution because as nature selects, then certain characteristics are weeded out. Now let's take this idea of Darwin and let us put it into a more global perspective, a larger perspective. We're not talking about moths and finches. We're going to talk about people and civilizations. There are groups of people that begin to take Darwin's ideas and they apply it to different fields. One of the areas where it gets applied is in the idea of civilizations. This comes to be called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. And you see the guy pictured on the left who does have some interesting sideburns, I think we can all agree. His name is Herbert Spencer. I put his picture up here because Herbert Spencer is one of the main proponents of social Darwinism. And then here you go. Here is a typical view. You see, they got us got the monkey on the left. Then you got in the middle, you got the guy standing upright, and then on the right, you got the guy on the computer. So you can see how it all. You go from monkey to guy with a computer, look pretty much the same. No? Okay, well. It's just, it's a little humor, very little. How things evolve. Now what it should be updated, for the cell phone lean or whatever it is. You do it in class. You do it when you walk around. People getting hit by cars. Because they're walking down the sidewalk, and then they just walk out into traffic and somebody runs them over. But you know what? They got that stuff posted before they got carted off to the morgue or the hospital. And when they get to the hospital, all they want to know is, where's my charger? I got to post this picture of my cast or something. Well, anyway, yeah, you get the idea. Well, Herbert Spencer then, 1820 to 1903. Herbert Spencer talks about taking the ideas of Darwin and then bringing them into the ideas of societies. So here the idea is that evolution occurs even in ideas, in customs, and in societies. So social Darwinism is going to pick up on this idea that the fittest individual survives, they're going to say the fittest society survives. They not only do survive, but they ought to survive, right? Because you want the strongest one to survive. The strongest or the fittest should survive and therefore should control things. Why? Because they are best adapted to our world. Well, for example, we've seen how things have changed in Europe and in England, for example. We've gone from almost no technology, right, to all kinds of industry, machines, using coal, using iron, using mechanisms, steam engines, and so forth. Those who are better adapted to create those ideas and to use those ideas are going to come to control things in the world. And Herbert Spencer would say, not only is that going to happen, I think he would say it ought to happen because of the idea of social Darwinism will bring about these the best things for the world in the end. Well, we need to end there for now. And I think you almost believed me. That's good. You did? All right. Well, it's just to wake you up. They say that what I ought to do is get your blood flowing. And so this is a way to get your blood flowing. So, now that you are awake, let's talk a little more about social Darwinism. Social Darwinism then becomes an idea that spreads across the world, and it becomes a justification for many of the things that were already happening. Those involved in imperialism or colonialism could now say, not only, do we want to do this for financial reasons or political reasons, but we have scientific reasons, right? We have, this is just the way things work. And didn't you read what Charles Darwin wrote? We're just sort of carrying out, this is just sort of the natural way that the world works, and we just happen to be the guys who are the fittest right now, given the parameters of the world. All right. Let's move on, shall we? So this is social Darwinism. So as I said, social Darwinism is going to fuel imperialism. It's going to be a justification for it, but it's actually going to encourage others to say, well, I guess if it's the sort of intellectual basis for it, and maybe I was feeling a little guilty about it, but now I don't, because this is just the best for everybody, is that those who are the strongest will come in and take control. And the idea is that competition was the best thing. Competition is going to bring out the best in people and in society. No, there is a sense that I think that's true. I think competition does encourage people to do better. You may not agree, but if for example, I just said, everybody in this class has an A. You're all going to get an A. Whether you come to class or not, doesn't matter if you do the assignments or not, doesn't matter how you do on the quizzes or even take them or not. My guess is most of you would not do anything. She says immediately true. So the idea is that there has to be certain obstacles there. You might think of them as obstacles. I think of them as learning opportunities. In order to motivate you to study. In other words, if you really would study and you really would learn this material, it would be fine with me if there were no assignments or tests. I don't particularly like assignments or tests or grading them or giving people grades. Why do we have that system? I have that system really because if I didn't have that system, I'd probably get in trouble with the administration because they'd say nobody's going to do any work in your class if you don't have any assignments or tests or anything. If everybody just really wanted to learn and we just got together on Tuesdays and Thursdays and, you know, you guys did some reading, did some other stuff outside, and then we just came and talked about it, that's the ideal, right? At least that would be my ideal. That all of you would be engaged and interested, and that you would want to learn. You have a thirst for knowledge, and we can all learn together. Well, without the system that we have, as flawed as this system might be at times, I think this is a far better system in the end to achieve the results than if we abandon it. Right? Because if I abandon it and the whole school abandoned it, my guess is the school would lose its accreditation pretty quickly. And if we lost our accreditation, well then nobody would want to come here because your degree would not be accredited then, right? And a lot of people would not accept it. So we have this system. It is a system. Is it a perfect system? No, it is not. But competition does promote people to strive harder. At least a lot of people. For example, if you're going to run a race, let's say you're going to run, I don't know, a mile race, right? You keep track of that. You have everybody start at one spot. You have everybody finish at one spot. You have somebody taking the time and watching it, making sure everybody does it according to the rules. And then in the end, you give an award or whatever to the first place, second place, third place, or whatever. And you keep track of your time and you keep track of what you do. And then you say, okay, next time I'm going to try to do better. Next time I'm going to try to beat that other person from wherever who got first place. I got second place. I want to be first place next time. So I'm going to train harder. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to work on my strategy or whatever for how I'm doing my running and my training, and then the next race that comes, maybe you could win. Competition, I think, if we all said, hey, everybody's just going to get together and, we're all going to run a mile. It's all going to be fun, We're not going to keep track of anything. Don't worry. Everybody's a winner. In our society today, we've kind of gone more to that, to eliminate competition. Right? Everybody's a winner. Everybody gets a trophy. Everybody gets a ribbon. And some people are very opposed to competition. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I still think competition motivates people. And if we remove all of it, we remove a lot of the motivation people have. So we may end up with everybody in the room getting a ribbon. Nobody's going to be that motivated to do better and keep track of things. Well, you can discuss that on your own. But that's sort of the idea here. And I'm not saying that I accept social Darwinism. I'm just saying that the idea of competition is not one and the same as social Darwinism, but I think it does bring about people striving harder, working harder. Well, this is the idea. It gave a rationale for what, in part what they were already doing. By the way, this is what a lot of people want anyway, is they want a rationale to do what it is they're already doing or what they already want to do. I can tell you that. I'm actually a minister, believe it or not. Somebody ordained me a long time ago. And I worked in campus ministry for many years at a university in Ohio. And I used to have people come in and talk to me about things besides history. And what I noticed was over the years, a lot of times people wanted me to sort of give them permission to do what it was they were already doing, or what they already wanted to do. Because then they could say, well, that guy, he's a religious guy, he's a minister or whatever, he said it was okay if I wanted to cheat on my test or whatever it was, or if I wanted to do this weekend. They would come in and kind of ask me, sort of prompt me, leading the witness, I think they'd say in a court, leading the witness to get to the answer they wanted. Because they already wanted that. That's what people sort of want. They want to be able to do what it is they are already doing or what it is they already want to do, and they want to find a way that makes that okay. Right? Social Darwinism is one of those ways, I think. They were already really doing imperialism, but this gave them sort of permission. This gave them an intellectual way to look at it, to say, well, yeah, what we thought we should be doing is really what we are doing, what we ought to do, because this is what's really best for us and best for them and best for the whole world if we do this. Well, the most fit should be in charge. Human societies were seen as being like an organism. So if we take Darwin's ideas, of the finches or look at the moths or whatever, the societies are like that. Some societies are strong, some are not. Well, take for example, and they also age, right? They mature. So we often talk about societies as being, sort of infant or developing. They're young, a young society. We don't just mean that all the people in there are young, but it just got started. And then we talk about, strong, mature societies. But then we start to talk about old societies. They're getting weak. They're getting old, They're past their time. And, everybody's waiting around for them to kick the bucket, so to speak, and collect their inheritance. I can say that sadly, that happens with people as well, right? So I know you don't think much about wills or inheritance at this point in your life, but you should really have a plan, and so should your loved ones. Because a lot of things can happen. We see it in history, that when people are getting older, somebody thinks somebody's going to die, grandma is really sick. Well, we're all concerned for grandma, but who's going to get grandma's house? Who's going to get grandma's money that's in the bank? Who's going to get grandma's stuff? Those antiques. She got a lot of nice stuff. She always said that I should get this, that kind of thing. So this kind of posturing is also what countries do. For example, in the 1800s, the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to crumble. And all the other countries are gathering around it, already deciding what they're going to take. What can I get? And starting to fight with one another about it. Unfortunately, children fight over things, grandchildren and stuff, they fight over stuff even before grandma might be gone. So too with these countries, like the Ottomans. The Ottomans aren't gone, but people are already kind of fighting, positioning themselves to get things. So we see this kind of thing, that human societies are like organisms. They must adapt to survive. If they don't adapt to survive, then they're going to perish, and they're going to die. So in this case, in the 19th century, early 20th century, if you don't have industrialization, if you don't have that kind of technology, you're just not going to survive. And you know what? You shouldn't survive, someone would say. Your time is past. If you can't sort of keep up, well, you'll fall behind. It kind of reminds me, I don't know, you guys sort of look like the kind of people, if I was guessing, to spend a lot of your Saturday afternoons, Sunday afternoons, watching nature shows on television? No? Maybe not. Writing terms, that's good. That's what I like. I love it. The terms is the best part of the course. That's what people always tell me. They always remind me of the terms. Well, this has been several years ago, and I never really watched those kind of shows, but I think as I told you in here, sometimes you just find yourself watching one. Like you start flipping around, and you see different things, and then there's really not much on, and then you see like I stopped on one, and it was, they got one of those guys talking, yes, and now the zebras. It was about zebras. And there was a pool of water. It was in Africa somewhere. I don't know where it was, because I never got that part. But there was water. So I think it was a river, and they needed to cross the river. For some reason, these zebras really wanted to get on the other side of the river. I'm thinking, why don't you just stay over here? But they wanted to get across. And then in the river, however, are crocodiles. And so you know how they do the show. Here's the crocodiles. Their eyes are out there. Kind of like all those alligators out around here. And they're just looking around, waiting. They're very quiet. And then you see the zebras, and they're on the shore like, they're kind of hitting their hooves in this thing. And it's like they're thinking about it, right? Thinking about it. How are we going to get across? They know there's danger. They know I don't know if they can smell I don't know if they can smell the croc. I don't know if they can see them. Anyway, obviously they know something's up. And so what do? Well, they wait there for a while. But then there's one brave zebra who says, you know what? I'm going to be a zebra of action. I'm going to get this group going. And so what does that zebra do? He takes off on a run. He gallops into the river. And some of the other zebras start to follow him. Said, all right, Fred's going. Let's follow him. And then Fred gets out there. Crocodile grabs a hold of him. Fred's in trouble. What do the other zebras do? Do they stop and help him? Do they pound on the crocodile so he lets Fred go? No. They don't even slow down. They just keep going, man. Thanks, Fred. I don't even know if they said that. And they get across. A couple of them get taken out by the crocodiles, but the rest of them make it across. So Fred, was he brave? Was he stupid? Fred's dead. And we might say that's better for all of the zebras because, whatever was in Fred that said, hey, I'm going to go ahead and go, Fred's not going to have any baby Freds who are going to have that same idea. So therefore, the other more cautious zebras survive, and Fred, the ambitious zebra, or whatever he was, is now dead. He won't have any little baby zebras that'll carry on his ambition, or whatever it was, to the next generation. So this is the idea. You must adapt to survive, and otherwise it is deadly. So the idea here of social Darwinism is that social Darwinism is going to benefit both sides of the equation. If we're talking about Britain, it's going to benefit Britain by, of course, giving them money, resources, territory. But they would argue, because of social Darwinism, that the places where Britain goes is going to be benefited. Why? Well, they're going to get roads, hospitals, education, schools, right? Railroad, maybe, telegraph, stable government. All right, so here we see an idea by a researcher, I guess we'd call him, a naturalist, which makes a major impact on the world, not only in biology, but in many other disciplines. Everybody starts to look for this idea of evolution, or change, or development. And it makes its way also into what we might call political science or sociology or whatever you want to call this. All right, it makes its way into that idea, and it begins to fuel imperialism, and it begins to bring about even more imperialism. Well, the Europeans, as they take over territories in the world, could be in Africa, could be in Asia, wherever it is, they have different goals. They have different things that they're going to do. One of these that doesn't often get talked about, maybe sometimes it does, but it's converting the heathen, I'm going to call them. All right? Most of these people in other parts of the world, until the Europeans got there, were not introduced to Christianity of any form. They were Hindus, Buddhists, maybe Muslims. They were animists, or whatever they were. And so we're going to take the good news to these people. We're going to, when we come into a village, we're probably going to build a school. We might build a clinic or a hospital, but we're also going to build a church. In fact, the church is probably the first thing we're going to build. And then at the church, we can use it as a school. Or we could have a train. Maybe the train stops. Time to get on. And so we're going to convert the heathen. We're going to create institutions of higher education, institutions of health, education, transportation, communication, right? These people don't have a post office of any kind. We're going to have to get a post office. They don't have a telegraph, or, we're going to have to put up wires and get a telegraph going. They don't have proper roads. We're going to have to build better roads and bridges, build a train track so we can haul things in and out. And they need a proper, police force and government building, hospital and school. There's so much to be done. So many things that need to be built. So much good that we can do. We need to educate these native people. They don't even know how to read. They can speak their language, but they can't read. And of course, they can't read our language, which they really should. So we're going to teach them our language, right? Good old American, as I call it. English, anyway. They're going to teach them that. And then we set up a kind of rule or a government that's there. There's two kinds of rule that get set up. One is a direct form of rule, a direct form of government. By that I mean that the Europeans pretty much run it themselves. They have, in this case, often somebody called like a governor. The governor or the magistrate, or they'll have different names, of this country, this region, this area. And then under that there will be different groups, ministries or councils or departments that will then, so the governor will have a department of education, a department of transportation, a department of health and welfare or something. And so all of these things will be controlled that way. And there will be an advisory council, typically, of local people. Some local people will be on a council that will come and advise the governor or the government and say, they might say, well, how do you think the people will respond to this? And they say, well, they're not going to like that or whatever. Here, maybe you should try it this way. But they don't have to listen to what those people say, right? Then there is an indirect kind of rule. This is where local people, native people, rule, but key decisions or permission for key decisions has to come by the colonial advisors. And if things get too out of hand, well, maybe we switch to the other kind of rule, right, where it's direct. So this is where we would leave somebody in charge, They did this with the Ottomans, like in Egypt, the British. They left the local guy called a pasha in charge, but the pasha then had to kind of run things by the British Advisory Council. Can we do this? I'd like to do this or that. That sort of thing. But they leave that government in place. Those are usually where there's already a more established government that's already there, and then they begin to rule it. So we see that the Europeans then have certain goals and certain procedures for how they're going to carry out those goals. And this is how we take these ideas of nationalism that sort of becomes colonialism and imperialism, and then you wrap it into or cover it in this idea of Darwinism until you sort of justify the entire thing. All right, now we really are going to end.